And if there are any questions along the way, you can always put them in the chat. So 2 minutes, we'll get started talking about the 19th Amendment and the women's right to vote. Awesome. I think the live stream is working. Sophie, are you good over there?
Yes, sorry, I'm just moving you back.
Cool, thanks. Sophie, are you good over there? Oh, I can hear myself. I'm gonna move you over. The worst thing in the world is to hear myself. Okay, probably not the worst thing, but let's one more minute and we'll get started. Hello, David, nice to see you as well. We're getting ready to kick off and it's perfect timing that you're here and everybody else is here because it's time to begin. 30 minutes, lots of questions, lots of things to cover. I'm gonna begin recording. Welcome everybody, excited to have you in class today. Today is International Women's Day, and what a perfect topic to talk about is to talk about the United States Constitution and looking closely at the 19th Amendment that afforded women the right to vote. Tom Donnelly, our chief scholar at the National Constitution Center, is gonna help us tell the story and walk us through and answer all of our questions like he does every single week. And I'm Carrie Sotner, I'm the Chief Learning Officer here. So part of my job is just to ask Tom 8 million questions. So if you don't have them, don't worry, I will do it. And Tom, here are some of the questions that I wanted to ask and kind of get us started. You know, we always want to know when thinking about the women's right to vote, you know, who are the key figures and what does the 19th Amendment say exactly? You love to talk about federalism and we do too. So how was it a great example of understanding federalism? And then as we talk about the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we have to be really honest about there were a lot of women who were left out after 1920 and the 19th Amendment being ratified. And what is that story? But the key kind of driving question I have around this is how is the right to vote for women not just about the right to vote? You know, it's not as simple as getting the right to vote. Women were fighting for equality and freedom. And how does that lead up to the right to vote? And how is that intertwined with that? So there are big questions for the day. You want to kick us off and get started? We can start with a great quote from a powerful woman, but also we can dive into the 19th Amendment directly.
Yeah, let's start with the late Justice Ginsburg here in the landmark case United States versus Virginia. She had this powerful passage. Our nation has had a long and unfortunate history of sex discrimination. Women did not count among the voters composing We the People. Not until 1920 did women gain a constitutional right to the franchise. So it's a powerful reminder of the decades upon decades upon decades upon decades of fighting necessary to protect voting rights for women.
And so as we think about voting rights for women, and that brings us really nicely to the 19th Amendment, do you want to unpack the 19th Amendment for us? And then Warren already asked a great question that we're going to go to as soon as you're done unpacking the 19th. It brings us back to the 15th.
Okay, yeah, no, so this is the great text of the 19th Amendment. I'll read it aloud. It was ratified in 1920. The right of citizens of the United States to vote should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, one notable thing about this text is that the suffragists modeled this amendment after the 15th Amendment, which was ratified after the Civil War and banned racial discrimination in voting. They settled on this language in 1878. So remember that the amendments ratified in 1920, they settled on this language in 1878 and over 40 years before ratification. And this proposal, known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was then introduced in every Congress from 1878 until it was finally approved by Congress on June 4th, 1919, and it was eventually ratified by 3/4 of the states in August of 1920. But you can see here in this, what Curry puts up on the screen here is that these two amendments are almost identical. All you're doing is replacing race, color, or previous condition of servitude from the 15th Amendment with the word sex in the 19th Amendment. But it's also a reminder that these two amendments fit into one of the great themes in all of American constitutional history, which is that if you looked at the original Constitution, the issue of voting and elections was largely left to the states. But over time, we, the people, ratified a series of voting rights amendments that expanded new protections to new groups over time. The 15th Amendment banned racial discrimination in voting. The 19th Amendment gave protections based on sex. And then finally, with the 26th Amendment, we had other protections based upon age. That's 1870 was the 15th Amendment, 1920, the 19th Amendment, 1971, the 26th Amendment. So you can see that's a century of work to expand voting rights in the United States with new amendments to the Constitution.
So the idea that voting is left up to the states to decide who gets to vote, when we put it into the Constitution, it supersedes that and says, you cannot deny it based on these ideas. So the language is very much like, you're not allowed to deny it based on these reasons. But Warren's first question was, when you look at the 15th Amendment and you look really closely, there's nothing about gender in here or sex in here. So why couldn't women vote after the 15th Amendment?
So with the 15th Amendment, the way to think about it is that it's taking away certain excuses that states have for not allowing someone to vote. So with the 15th Amendment, it's saying states, you have a lot of power over voting in elections, but you can no longer take race, color, or previous condition of servitude into account. But even states still have massive power to define who can vote within their jurisdictions. And so they still could pass laws, and they did, that restricted the franchise to men. So eventually it would take, new state laws to push women's suffrage by the states, but eventually to write it into the Constitution to make it a national rule, it took the 19th Amendment.
Got it. Okay, that's really helpful. So it's like they're saying you can't deny based on these things, but you could deny still based on these other things that are out here, and you have to add that to the Constitution. Okay, that makes total sense. I was reading, like to read it backwards and be very Susan B. Anthony and be like, it's not mentioned in there, so I can vote. But we're going to get to that story and a few others. This leads us back to, going it back in time. So we laid out the Constitution, we laid out where voting is in the Constitution, how it's connected to race in the 15th Amendment, how it's connected to sex in the 19th Amendment. But this is more than, and I don't want to undermine the right to vote because it's such a powerful right, but it's more than just the right to vote. It's the right to have you be in charge of yourself, in charge of your life, in charge of the people who are making the laws that affect you. So going back to early America, can you unpack for us the fight for women and equality and how that wraps into the fight for the right to vote?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, of course it's all connected, and it was all connected from the very beginning for women who wanted the right to vote. So in the end, when we're talking about the push, especially as we get into the 1800s, of the suffragists, it's combined with a series of other things they're asking for. Very basic things like the right as a married woman to hold property, to have access to your wages if you labor, to have equal rights to your children, all sorts of laws that were stacked against women and in favor of their husbands. Women were pushing hard for those things even before they were pushing for the right to vote. But they also importantly knew over time that the right to vote was the key to holding greater political power in America. And because of that, and because of the laws they saw stacked against them, they would pursue all of those things. So equality, in employment, in education, in child rearing, and all of those sorts of things. But they would also push for the right to vote. So they were all connected.
Yeah, and it's really important to kind of see all these pieces together. And when we think about women's right to vote, we have to be clear. Women were voting in early America. So it's not like it comes out of nowhere in the 1880s and women are pushing for it. We actually have women's suffrage going on in like the great state of New Jersey, across the river from us, right where we are, where you are, Tom.
Yeah, that's right. So, if we're thinking back at the founding, what did that universe look like? Well, as we already said, under the original Constitution, issues of voting and elections largely left to the states. And if you're looking across the universe of all the states, the general rule was the vote was going to be restricted to white male property holders. So from that perspective, really looking at the founding, women were excluded from the vote for the same reason that other groups were, like poor white men, those who didn't hold property. All of them were seen as dependent economically, politically, and legally on other people. For women, they were seen as dependent on their husbands. And so that was sort of the theory, the vision behind limiting the suffrage, but it was sort of the same way the poor were seen as really beholden to or those who didn't hold property were beholden to landowners and their bosses. And so there's this universe of laws there that's limiting voting to white male property holders. But you're right, Curry, in early America, there were women voting. In my home state of New Jersey, from 1776 to 1807, unmarried female landowners voted. However, by 1807, New Jersey decided to close off this brief period of women's suffrage, limiting the vote to free white male citizens. And so that's the most early period. We didn't see, as we get into the era of Jacksonian democracy, so the 1820s into the 1830s, we do see massive changes in American voting broadly. But the big theory there for the Jacksonians was we are going to create universal white male suffrage. So states abolish property requirements from voting. And so poor white men are now allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to vote at the founding. They are allowed to vote in the 1820s and 30s. But we also, during this period, see restrictions for other groups, including for women. But you're right, Curry. It's not as though it's only in the late 1800s and into the 20th century where women are pushing for the right to vote. We see as we get into the mid 1800s, women beginning to push back. Women organizing conventions and lectures, circulating ideas in newspapers, petitioning state governments to vote to recognize various women's rights, including the right of married women to hold property. And in many ways, the biggest symbol of what's going on here in the historical memory is in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. It was a local gathering attracting about 300 people. And the famous document arising from this gathering was primarily authored by Susan B. Anthony. It's the Declaration of Sentiments. So this is the big document that comes out of the Seneca Falls Convention. It ends up being signed by 68 men, 32 women. What's really cool about this document, and I urge you, find it online. It's not a really long document to read, but what Stanton and the reformers at Seneca Falls do is they take the Declaration of Independence and its language, and then they use it to advance a vision of women's equality. And so they literally rewrite the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence had a bunch of complaints against King George III in Parliament. And instead, Stanton ends up framing the Declaration of Sentiments, explaining all of the wrongs that men have done to women. And you could see here this powerful language gives you a sense of the flavor of the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And so Stanton's using the language of the Declaration of Independence as a model involving, invoking natural law principles of the American Revolution to push for broader liberty and equality for women. And the Declaration closes with 12 demands. It includes equal education, equal pay, equal property rights, and, quote, the sacred right to the elective franchise. And so it's this powerful vision of what it would take to bring greater equality to women in America.
And I think this is so amazing. And we see this over and over again when telling the story of American history with so many groups, taking the key documents that we hold as a document that embodies our values, and the group that's pushing to be included, taking that document and saying it means us too. And we're going to use it to kind of bolster up our narrative and our argument. They're using primary sources to defend their argument, like we're all taught in school how to do really well, and to add to it and to say, this is what it really means when we read it correctly. As we kind of dive into this, we start to see how the women's rights movement is connected to the abolitionist movement, and that those two groups for a while are intertwined. So when we talk about the 15th Amendment, we talk about the 13th and 14th Amendment, it's connected to the 19th Amendment, and we can see those as a bundle together. So can we, kind of kick off that story of how do we lead to this National Women's Rights Convention and then the era of Reconstruction?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the suffragists, many of them were so closely connected to the anti-slavery movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, these were all key figures pushing for an end to slavery, but also for the women's right to vote. And so we reached this moment after the Civil War where we're looking to set new constitutional baselines for America. And so we see the suffragists joining together with their traditional allies among the abolitionists and anti-slavery folks. And so what they push for a vision of universal voting rights. So suffrage for both African-American men and all women. And so what we see during Reconstruction is a series of massive amendments, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment writing promises of freedom and equality into the Constitution, the 15th Amendment banning racial discrimination in voting. These are big constitutional changes. And for the suffragists, what this means is, my goodness, we're altering the Constitution to do these big things. We just fought a war to end slavery. National government's using its power to recognize new rights and promote equality for all African Americans. Everything seems possible. Even the vote for women seemed possible. And so we see, again, a united front of reformers, African American and white reformers, arguing that voting right, it's not about sex, it's not about race, but it's about post-Civil War America's commitment to equality. And one of the key figures in these debates is this person you see on the screen here, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So Harper was an African American, born free, educated in Baltimore. In 1852, she began to participate on the abolitionist speaking circuit. So again, you see this connection between suffrage rights and people who were involved in the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War. And as a poet and outspoken reformer, she spoke at the National Women's Rights Convention in 1866. It's the convention that founded the American Equal Rights Association. Basically, all the movers and shakers in the reformist world are at this convention. And there she advances a broad vision for universal rights. Here she says, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving a curse in its own soul. In its own soul. So during this period, we see biracial coalitions of women and men pushing for universal suffrage. And so they flood Congress with petitions. They push the Republican Congress hard to really recognize this universal suffrage vision. But ultimately, the Republican Party that's in charge after the Civil War, this is the party of Lincoln, it's the party of union, they decide to prioritize African American rights over women's suffrage. And so we see part of this is driven by members of Congress believing in the traditional role of women in the home. So we do see some of those notions, certainly for some of the Republican leaders, playing a role. But we also see, that in the actual constitutional reforms we see during this period, we see with the 15th Amendment, a focus on race and not on sex. And even in the 14th Amendment, if you read Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which was meant to protect meant to promote African-American male suffrage, we for the first time write a gender into the Constitution. We write voting rights for men into the Constitution in Section 2. And so this move ends up completely splitting many of the suffragists from their traditional abolitionist allies. It splits the women's suffrage movement more broadly into two organizations, the National Women's Suffrage Association with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the head, choosing to oppose the 15th Amendment, which banned racial discrimination in voting, and fighting exclusively for women's suffrage first. So it's Anthony and Stanton turning away from the Republican Party and many of their traditional allies among the old abolitionists and the anti-slavery folks. And then we see another organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and Henry Brown Blackwell. They support the 15th Amendment. They continue to side with the Republican Party, prioritize African-American rights, and remain committed to a vision of universal rights. So this is great friction, great conflict within the movement itself.
Yeah, and I neither of the group wanted to give up Women's Suffrage Association title. Like they're both like, no, we're holding on to this. This is what we do. And you do see a split. So thank you for engaging in that, because the story around the 19th Amendment and the fight for the 19th Amendment also is the story around how the party that pushes for this splits and how it falls apart based on race lines as well. So looking at women, but also looking at women and race around these questions. And we see these stories intermix with the stories of, of protest, of the stories of, big giant commencements in Washington, D.C., and kind of interweaving that. So we have to look at that intersectionality as we dive through on all these pieces. Now, as we're kind of moving forward, we do see some people trying to utilize what's in the 14th and 15th Amendment to try to push for women's right to vote before the 19th Amendment. And that brings us to a pretty big case, Minor v. HAPPERSETT. Do you want to dive in there next?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important. Yeah, the suffragists may have lost those battles over the 14th and 15th Amendment, but they didn't give up on the Constitution. And so they looked at the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment promises to protect the privileges or immunities of United States citizenship. And so we see certain suffragists, even with some suffragists actually turned to Congress, Curry. So before the courts, they even turned to Congress. And they say, Congress, under the 14th Amendment, you have the power to promote the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. We women are citizens of the United States. What is more clearly a privilege or immunity of citizenship than the right to vote? What's more fundamental? And so we see key figures like Victoria Woodhull go to Congress, testify before Congress. She's one of the first people to do this. And she says, I do now claim that I am equally with men, possessed of the right to vote. Why? Because of the Reconstruction Amendments, because of the 14th Amendment, because of the 15th Amendment. And then we see other suffragists, though, turn to the courts. They make a similar argument under the 14th Amendment. This strategy is known as the new departure. And again, like Woodhull, they argue that the 14th Amendment, under the 14th Amendment, of voting is a privilege of US citizenship protected by the Constitution, and they call on the courts to recognize this. So from 1868 to 1875, hundreds of women embraced this argument. Some women actually vote successfully in some local areas. Others were turned away, arrested, or fined, including famously Susan B. Anthony. And what's so interesting about this movement is it culminates in one of the first big voting rights cases before the Supreme Court, Minor v. Happersett. Virginia Minor was one of the pioneers of this new departure argument. She challenged the St. Louis registrar's decision to block her from registering to vote. She argues that no, registrar, you can't block me from voting. I'm a United States citizen. Voting is a privilege of citizenship. Supreme Court recognized this right, recognized that the 14th Amendment guarantees women the right to vote, but the Supreme Court rejects this claim. In a unanimous decision written by Chief Justice Morrison Waite, the court agrees that women are US citizens, but disagrees with the new departure, saying that voting is not a privilege or immunity of national citizenship protected by the 14th Amendment. What Waite says instead is that, as always, the Constitution leaves these questions, this question of whether women can vote or not to the Supreme Court, but to the state and local governments.
And so now kind of like moving next. So it's fascinating and it's brilliant. You're watching the women's rights movement kind of push and say, okay, we're going to test this. We're going to push every single branch of government and we're going to test it. We're going to look for avenues in and we're going to look for ways moving forward. Now with the final departure, they know they need a constitutional amendment, but we're also seeing federalism start to kick in and saying like, we're going to give some privileges to women in different states on different levels to vote as well. So you're watching kind of this bottom up through federalism and top down push for the 19th Amendment go on at the same time. And why is that really important? Why wouldn't you just wait for all the states to finally catch on? And why would we want to do both at the same time? And you can get to that, but I'm adding questions as we go through.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so this is great. So you're right, Corey. There's action at the state level. There's action at the national level. So let's start with the action at the state level. Effectively, what suffragists are doing here is they're saying, okay, Chief Justice Waite, you said we have this power at the state level to get women the right to vote. Let's go state by state and try to do it. And so it's this great example of what Justice Louis Brandeis famously calls the states as laboratories of democracy. On this view, states often lead the way in trying out new laws and practices. And when they work out well, those practices can then be adopted by other states. So the theory here for women is, okay, everyone's arguing that it's a bad idea for women to vote. We suffragists disagree. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to find some states that will allow women to vote. And once we vote, we're going to show we're good voters. There's nothing to be feared from it. In fact, it's very good for the nation. And so what women do is they begin out west. So the first win that they have is in 1869, where the Wyoming Territory grants women the right to vote. We then see in the 1880s and 1890s, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah also giving women the right to vote. And what ends up happening, Curry, is women vote out west, and it's fine. We see that it works. And so we see more and more states over time, especially as we get into the early 20th century, saying, no, that experiment worked out well there. We're going to give women the right to vote in our states. So we see, especially from 1910 onward, many, many states grant women the full right to vote. Washington, California, Arizona, Kansas, Oregon, Montana, Nevada, and then New York, which is a huge one. In 1917, a big state granting women the right to vote, and Michigan, another big state in 1918 doing the same. So by 1919, 15 states permitted women full voting rights in the state. And even many states that didn't provide full voting rights still granted women some sort of voting rights in certain contexts, maybe in presidential elections or in school board elections. And finally, this experiment bubbles up and culminates in the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, and so at the same time, you see kind of this national push going on as well. But one question before we leave the state by state, it's clearly very West Coast centric, and it's kind of moving from the West Coast towards the East Coast, which is odd because it started in the East Coast with New Jersey. So it always felt like a flip-flop for me. It's like you had rights, you took them away, and now, you know, the other side. Why is that? So why are those states the ones to be more, like, in this time period, more open to giving women the right to vote?
Well, there are a lot of different theories about that, Curry. You know, one of them is we do just see a lot of, so the West it's like a newer area, and we do see a lot of innovative constitutional ideas coming from the West. So even in the late 1800s, the agrarian populace had all sorts of ideas, many of them, their power coming from the West. Things like an income tax, the direct election of senators, those are bubbling up in terms of constitutional innovation. The other is that some scholars argue that it was also about, we had a lot of men out West and they wanted to attract women to migrate out West. And one of the ways they could do that was by honoring women's rights. And so both of those things together, you know, made the West a fertile soil for this sort of constitutional reform.
Fascinating. I like the innovation idea. There are also a lot of the states that did vote from home. So one of our educators kind of overlapped voting from home with the state women's rights. And you see some like kind of innovation going on in voting overall from those kind of core states over there. Fascinating. Okay, now let's move on to the national fight that comes out in pomp and circumstance in these amazing parades to get attention and kind of to rally the American public behind the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, so there's all of this action at the national level too. Some of it is really bold, militant, direct action in the context of that period. And so momentum's building at the state level. We have this new generation of suffragist leaders then pushing for action in Washington, D.C. Some of these actions, they're literally taking to the street, as you see here, Curry, with the woman suffrage procession. What's happening there? Well, it's the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and an estimated 5,000 women descend on Washington. And their goal is to march from the Congress, the Capitol at the top, all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue. Instead, they're greeted by violence. The violence erupts. We see women injured. 100 women end up in the hospital. And so Wilson now is forced to share headlines in his inauguration with this terrible incident of both activity and violence among women parading in Washington, D.C. Public sympathy stir. But the other thing, Curry, that we see during this period, during this particular women's suffrage procession in 1913, is that women of color do join their fellow suffragists in this parade. But the parade organizers say, women of color, you need to march to march at the back of the parade. And so we see there the parade organizers giving in to, you know, frankly, some of the racial bias, especially of Southern white suffragists. But we also see 4 state delegations said, no way, we are going to march as an integrated delegation. And for instance, we see Ida B. Wells, one of these great figures in the civil rights movement. She was also a suffragist. She said, she's from Illinois. She's like, no way, I'm not marching in the back of the parade. And so she broke ranks quickly, joined her Illinois delegation. If you don't know about Ida B. Wells, please read about her. She's this amazing figure. Just a quick beat on her is that one of the she was a courageous journalist who a lot of what we know about violence against African Americans in the South in the late 1800s and the early 20th century comes from Ida B. Wells's pioneering journalism, courageous journalism that she did there. So she's a great suffragist. She's a great civil rights hero. She's also one of the founders of the NAACP. She's just an unbelievably huge figure.
And yeah, she's just the best reads, the best stories that you can get to. And there's also a new doll, I think from like the Barbie collection that is focused on Ida B. Wells. So now it's also a doll. So just to add to it as well. And so one of my favorite stories to tell when we talk about the White House, when we talk about protests and we talk about protests in DC, the first protest at the United States White House is women. So how much does this influence and how much work do they have to do? How much does this influence the executive branch?
Yeah, so this is, again, we don't think of it, well, protesting in front of the White House. Is that a big deal? Why would that be a big deal? This is Alice Paul, the National Women's Party, wanting to bring it right to Woodrow Wilson's doorstep. So there's a lot of support in Congress for women's suffrage at this point in time, but Woodrow Wilson is one of the great fence sitters on the issue. He refuses to really take a stand, and so the National Women's Party bring it to his doorstep. This is part of a broader push by women, especially around, it starts in 1917. That's also the year the United States enters World War I. And so there's a lot that's going on in that point in time that's pushing us towards women's suffrage. For some of the supporters of women's suffrage, they are loyal Americans during World War I, doing their duty and proving that women are loyal and will support the war effort. So that is part of what's going on. We see other key figures, national organizations, lobbying Congress, continuing to do just the hard work you would do on any big bill before Congress or any big constitutional amendment. So there's insiders working behind the scenes to push for action. But it's Alice Paul and her supporters that say, no, we are going to take this right to the White House. And so they picket the White House. They hold up, the banners they actually hold up during their protests are kind of amazing. They draw on language from the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. For instance, one banner read, "Governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed." So these protests end up going on for an entire year. Prior to US entry into World War I, Woodrow Wilson's kind of amused by these protests. He waved to the protesters. But after US entry into World War I, there's a greater concern about sort of cracking down on dissent in America from the Wilson administration. And so they begin arresting the protesters, but the protesters keep coming. And because of actually some of the protesters' mistreatment while in prison, public opinion really continues to be pushed in the direction of the women's suffrage movement. And so we see this combination of women's loyalty at home during World War I, national lobbying of Congress for pushing for a constitutional amendment, and this direct action by the National Women's Party, all pushing the United States in the direction of the 14th Amendment. And eventually Congress in January 1918, Wilson declares support in 1918 for women's suffrage. Congress passes the 19th Amendment in 1919. And then finally, there's this final obstacle of ratification. So Congress approves the amendment. It requires 2/3 vote in each House of Congress, but then 3/4 of the states have to approve of the amendment after that. Finally, in August 1920, we cross that threshold and the 19th Amendment becomes part of the Constitution.
Awesome. And I know we have to wrap up because it is time, but we cannot wrap up with the end of the 19th Amendment and saying, oh, women got the right to vote in 1920 without talking for just one beat on the continued fight to ensure that African-American women were included with the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, that's right. So in November 1920, many women across America vote for the first time. And President Warren Harding wins that election. And then for the women's suffrage movement, the question becomes, what's next? What's next? Women of color, of course, look at this and say, the right to vote. We don't have the right to vote in so much of the country, much like African-American men. And so we may have the 19th Amendment, we may even have the 15th Amendment. But things like intimidation, violence, and Jim Crow laws, especially in the South, continue to keep women away from the polls. Unfortunately, many of their white suffragist allies do not join in the fight for African-American women's suffrage, but instead African-American join with men of color for a broader movement to push for the right to vote, to push back against Jim Crow segregation. It would take decades upon decades, really from 1920, when the 19th Amendment is ratified, all the way until finally the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where we finally remove many of these barriers to voting. And this landmark law empowers the national government to protect voting rights for all people of color and to attack state voter discrimination laws. Congress passed this law under its authority under the 15th Amendment, but it could also be seen as realizing the promise of the 19th Amendment for women of color. And the Supreme Court upholds the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in a case called South Carolina versus Katzenbach. It's a huge success, and we see massive expansion of voting participation by African Americans, both men and women, after the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. That was really helpful. I just want to make sure we're telling the whole story, and that was perfect. So thank you, students, so much. If you have any more questions, you can feel free to hang out for a minute. I'm going to stop the recording and all those things really quick.